So greetings to our guests, to our virtual audience, and my fellow Lemkin Institute team members who are all volunteers and who do so much work to ensure that the Lemkin Institute can function on a day-to-day basis and that we can hold these events on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. I want to welcome everybody very warmly to today's symposium, When Genocide is Global, the Armenian Case. I am Elisa von Joeden-Forgey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention. This is the second in a series of symposia we are holding as part of our 2024 Year of Prevention initiative. You can find all of our past and upcoming events at our website, www.lemkininstitute.com. As everybody knows, April 24th will mark the 109th anniversary of the start of the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1923. Since that time, the Armenian people have fought to find and maintain security for their identity, both within the remnant of their core ancestral lands, the modern independent state of the Republic of Armenia, and within the growing global diaspora. However, since there was never true justice or accountability for the genocide of 1915 to 1923, or for the genocidal persecution of Armenians that predated it in the Ottoman Empire, the ideologies, institutions, and processes that influenced that genocide continue to pose a very real and present threat to Armenian life today. We need to look no further than Azerbaijan's ongoing genocide in Artsakh to see this. Additionally, as Turkey's importance to global geopolitics and resource competition has grown, so too has Armenophobia. At the Lemkin Institute, we consider Armenophobia to constitute a global hate ideology similar to anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, and anti-trans bigotry. We are looking very forward today to hear from our guests about how it is they approach the ongoing threats and the long-term threats to Armenian sovereignty at a time when the very existence of Armenian sovereign spaces is under threat. And this includes, of course, the republics of Artsakh and Armenia, but also the Armenian Quarter in East Jerusalem and diaspora communities that are increasingly threatened by the pan-Turkish Grey Wolves terrorist organization. So one of the things that I hope will come out of our discussion today is some ideas about how we as individuals and organizations can work closer together to push back effectively against these existential threats, and especially how we can encourage more participation from non-Armenian organizations in all of our protection and prevention efforts aimed at stopping Armenophobia and securing spaces in which Armenian life and identity can thrive. So without further ado, let's get started. We have 5 wonderful and esteemed speakers here with us today, and I'm very honored that each of these speakers was willing to give his and her time to be with us. Mr. Artsakh Beglarian, the former Ombudsman for the Republic of Artsakh, Karnig Kerkonian, an expert in international law and founding member of the Committee on the Protection of the Fundamental Rights of the Artsakh people, Dr. Edita Gzoyan, director of the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute in Yerevan, Dr. Henry Theriault, associate vice president for academic affairs at Worcester State University and former president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and Stephen Sim, independent researcher and photographer, as well as expert on the architecture of historical Armenia. We will have about 1 hour and 1 hour, maybe 1 hour and 15 minutes for presentations and a half hour for Q&A, a half hour to 15 minutes for Q&A. Attendees are encouraged to write their questions in the Q&A box, and our fabulous Lexi Poston from the Lemkin Institute will be sure to ask them during our Q&A session. So why don't we begin with Why don't we begin, Karnik, with you, with Mr. Kerkonian. Let me read your wonderful biography for all of our guests before you speak. And that way, in case you need to run, we will have heard from you. Mr. Kerkonian is a seasoned international lawyer. He currently leads the international and federal practice groups at Kerkonian Dajani LLP, focusing on complex litigation matters, Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act litigation, commercial sanctions regimes, and commercial transactions, both international and domestic. Mr. Kerkonian holds an A.B. magna cum laude in government from Harvard University and 2 law degrees, a J.D. from the University of Chicago, where he served on the law review, as well as a postdoctoral diploma in public international law from Cambridge University, England, where he studied under James R. Crawford, later a judge at the International Court of Justice. Upon completing his studies, Mr. Kerkonian joined Meyer Brown LLP in Chicago, working in federal litigation and appeals, and in 2003 began his own practice. A founding partner of Kerkonian Dajani LLP, Mr. Kerkonian regularly handles litigation and appeals, covering a range of subjects including foreign sovereign immunity, international business contracts, fiduciary duties, statutory and tort claims, often involving multinational commercial entities and/or foreign states. His transactional practice focuses on corporate transactions, including international acquisitions, joint ventures, and stock asset sales. Mr. Kerkonian is likewise active in public interest matters involving international human rights issues. He's been very involved, for example, in the issues surrounding the Republic of Artsakh and the Cow's Garden in Jerusalem. Mr. Kerkonian presents regularly on matters of public international law, the International Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, and the application of international law in U.S. courts. He is an adjunct professor of public international law at Artsakh State University. Thank you very much, Mr. Kerkonian, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Elisa, and it's a pleasure to be here, especially with this esteemed panel of colleagues here. And I'm very excited about the prospects of speaking here today and having a discussion with everybody on this very important and really timely topic. Those that follow the issues related to the Artsakh genocide will find what I'm going to say somewhat interesting, I hope, in the context of what I consider rather comical. It would be comical if it wasn't genocide. The sheer impunity and the evidence that is put forward by the state of Azerbaijan itself, and including the president of Azerbaijan, is really shocking. And often when I see some of the social media posts, especially the last one where President Aliyev is gloating about ethnic cleansing and lighting a fire almost like a smudge stick to get rid of any semblance or anything left of the Armenian spirit in Nagorno-Karabakh. One has to wonder at just what level of impunity we've allowed to take place in Azerbaijan. And it doesn't surprise me that that statement was made just after the NATO visit to Baku. I think it's all related, and I think it's really important to think about this in a larger context. I'm sure that my fellow panelists will speak more about the aspects of genocide in this context, Armenophobia in its factual sense. As a lawyer, I think I'm going to approach this very differently, and if I can have maybe 5-6 minutes to kind of talk through some of these key points that I'd like to raise just as thoughts for consideration for people. It may surprise everyone that perpetrators of genocide, perpetrators of human rights violations, do not actually care about human rights. And I say that, and not as an axiomatic thought, but as a point which occurred to me when I was listening to a lecture by by Professor Umit Kurt about the Armenian genocide, and specifically in what had happened in Aintab. And what was interesting to me about that lecture was that he spoke about the economic aspects to genocide. And it made me realize that as an attorney, that perhaps we have to start approaching this issue differently. We have to actually be thinking about the fact that there are people that benefit from genocide, financially benefit from genocide, and really think through the fact that sometimes criminal actions themselves might not do the trick. And I say that because law is a very complex and developed area, and it's constantly developing in the area of international law and accountability for human rights violations, including genocide. And I like to kind of split it into two big sections, right? You have like these criminal actions, which are brought by individual states under something called universal jurisdiction, in which case their legislation says that they're able to prosecute claims for violations of human rights, regardless of where they occur in the world. That's universal jurisdiction. And then you have something else that has kind of taken, quite a great interest throughout, the social media presence on this issue, and that's the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction in certain cases regarding war crimes. Now, what's interesting, I don't think people realize that the ICC has brought less than 50 cases in its entire history. That's an important fact, because we know that there are more than 50 perpetrators of war crimes, and whether it's acts of genocide or otherwise, over the last 40 years or however long we've had jurisdiction of the ICC, which means that a lot of people don't have to face consequences. And frankly, of those 50 cases, 25 or so of them are still out for service. In other words, the ICC is essentially chasing them to get jurisdiction. So this is an important point about what the ICC can and can't do. It's also important to kind of think through then, if we can't use, and with respect to universal jurisdiction, we have situations where we have to actually convince foreign prosecutors of these countries to actually bring cases under universal jurisdiction. If you think through that, you understand that that's a very political process. So there are a lot of political concerns that then interrupt the legal judicial process. So listening to Umit Kurt's lecture about how individual people profited from the genocide, in particular, the kind of this microcosmic look at what was happening in Aintab, made me realize that if perpetrators don't care about human rights, which is why they commit these crimes, because that's not what they're guided by, and if the criminal context has a lot of political aspects, if you're using universal jurisdiction, or other significant limitations if you're trying to use the ICC, we should be exploring how to bring perpetrators of human rights violations, and particularly genocide perpetrators, to justice using civil actions, which attacks what they actually care about, which is money, power, and their influence. And we've had a lot of success in dealing with these types of handling these types of cases with respect to Armenian rights issues, be they in Jerusalem, be they in related to Artsakh Armenians. So this is kind of an area that I think is worth exploring further and really scaling up, and that is trying to find angles for perpetrators to be brought to justice using civil context cases. And what the benefits of that are, number one, is it attacks the perpetrator where it matters the most to the perpetrator. And that's a very important point. I think sometimes in the human rights field, we get so caught up in what is important to us, we don't realize what's important to the person who is committing these crimes. And while they're alive and walking, some would argue that attacking them where it hurts the most, in their pocketbooks and their businesses and their access to power structures, is probably one of the most significant ways to try to debilitate human rights violators in their tracks. And we've had some success with this. And I think it's important to realize that there's two aspects that trouble criminal cases, human rights criminal cases, that don't exist in the civil context. The first is that you don't have the lack of inertia that you would have, that we see in the ICC, where it's been unable to really nail perpetrators. It's been unable to really serve perpetrators and bring them to justice. So that's one. The other is you don't have the problem of trying to convince a government politically that it's in their interest to bring the case. What you have to do is have a plaintiff. And unfortunately, in the Armenian sense, we have a lot of plaintiffs. In other words, injured parties. And so there's a lot more control over the process than you would have in the criminal context. So I think this is kind of an interesting way to look at accountability for acts of genocide and other human rights violations. We've brought cases related to this. We have one, and we bring them in courts that actually have jurisdictional weight. We have cases pending in the United States related to these types of issues, in particular with the Artsakh genocide situation, which was actually, we actually filed one of these cases during the blockade itself, for aiding and abetting false imprisonment and aiding and abetting violation of the Torture Victim Protection Act. So there are mechanisms to be used in the civil context that are valuable in bringing perpetrators to justice when you're dealing with genocide today. The other thing I want to talk about real briefly is kind of where do we go from here? And it's kind of peculiar to kind of speak first, although given the fact that most of the panelists will probably bring a lot more historical perspective to the issue, but assuming that we have the historical perspective, which you're going to hear very shortly from my co-panelists, I think we have to think about the right of return as a mechanism in which to abort plans of genocide or to stunt ongoing genocide. And this is kind of an important point, which kind of gets lost perhaps in the discussions, because we like to think of things as a fait accompli because it makes it very easy for us to then deal with. But in the particular instance of the Artsakh Armenians, it's not a fait accompli. There is ongoing genocide right now. We always hear of the day-to-day cultural heritage that is being destroyed. The idea of genocide, of course, is a destruction of people. And I'm sure that my co-panelists will discuss the way this fits within that rubric. You don't need bloodshed to have a genocide. And that's clear from the Genocide Convention in Articles 2B and 2C. And I think we have that clearly in this situation. Not only do we have evidence of that, but there's already been a number of articles and statements and reports put out, one by the Lemkin Institute regarding the Artsakh genocide. If I'm not mistaken, the Lemkin Institute called this one of the most efficiently executed genocides, and that's really important to think about. But how do we stunt that? How do we stop the impact of this? And how do we use this the right of return as a preventative mechanism is something we need to think about. And it's not idealism. I think that there's a real kind of important point to realize for perpetrators of genocide to realize that they are not able to close the book. They're not able to turn the page on this. And the right of return is one of those legal principles that has gained a lot of traction over the last, I would say, several weeks, if not the last 2 or 3 months, with respect to the Artsakh Armenian situation. And I want to talk about what that right of return means for the Artsakh Armenians, because I think it's important to really realize it in the full context of genocidal intent. There is clearly genocidal intent. There have been acts of genocide. So how in the world do we undertake this? How do we look at this issue of the right of return in the context of genocide and genocidal intent? Well, obviously, it's not as simple as saying, let's get on a bus and go back. That's not the answer. And that's not what the right of return under international law provides. What it does provide is that return has to be safe and secure to allow for a dignified presence. Now, what does that mean in the context of the Artsakh Armenians? And I've kind of thought through this, and really kind of 3 pillars really stand out about what this means. And those 3 pillars are that the return needs to be a collective return. That's the first. And when I say collective, what I mean is that it cannot be a return of 5 to 10 to 15,000 Armenians to Artsakh to allow the Azerbaijani government to say, look, they've returned, end of story. And the reason why it can't be such a small number is that collective return has to ensure the people's cultural and religious integrity, their social cohesion, and their collective strength as a people, and that needs to be preserved and reinforced. So it's essential for survival and flourishing in the indigenous native Armenian homeland of Artsakh that the people return en masse. So this idea of collective return is the first very important pillar of the preventative use of the right of return. The second important aspect here, given the genocidal intent, is that it be done under international protection. This means that we need international protection and an international presence on the ground to safeguard the people of Artsakh. And the global community here has to step in with decisive, concrete measures to protect the Artsakh people from any form of aggression, injustice, oppression, subjugation, and genocide. And this is not an act of international benevolence, right? This is a duty to prevent historical wrongs from repeating. And the protection obviously needs to be robust, it needs to be visible, and it needs to be enduring. And there can't be any room left for ambiguity or half measures. So we have now the idea of a collective return, the idea of international protection. And the final pillar, I would say, is that it has to respect the Artsakh Armenians' fundamental rights as an indigenous people, including the right to self-determination. The return of Artsakh Armenians does not mean that they then have to forfeit their right of self-determination. If we remember from the rhetoric that started kind of the lowering of the bar on the Artsakh Armenians, was this was one of the main ideas, is to stop talking about them. In fact, Europe and the United States pushed Yerevan to stop talking about the Artsakh Armenians as a people, in other words, as a people with the right to self-determination, and start speaking about them as a minority in terms of people that have minority rights. Well, that distinction is fundamental, because distinct peoples and indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. Minorities don't, and that's that specific dichotomy in the language that we used to discuss the Artsakh situation was one of the principal causes for how we ended up in the situation that we're in right now. So the right of return also has to incorporate these fundamental rights, and it's because it's more than just about returning to a place. It's about reasserting the Artsakh people's inalienable right to live freely, to govern themselves, and preserve their identity and unique heritage in their homeland. So I can end with that. I think I've kind of highlighted those 2 points I wanted to talk about: the criminal versus civil context in prosecuting civil rights, in prosecuting human rights violations, and also the right of return as a preventative measure to ongoing genocide, and what I consider the 3 critical pillars to that.
Thank you so much, Karnik, for that wonderful set of ideas. Very provocative, very hopeful. And I can think of many cases outside of Artsakh where the sort of right of return, as you laid it out, is quite relevant. And I think you're right. This could be a very strong mechanism of prevention, right, and of stopping genocidal processes as they're ongoing. So I hope we have time to talk more about that in the Q&A. Thank you so much. And thank you also for mentioning the manipulation of language that has sought to, that not just by Azerbaijan, but even worse, by many complicit nations in the Western world, that has served to sort of allow genocide to occur under the radar, which is just a remarkable feat and needs to be challenged, because otherwise this will become the norm in the 21st century. So thank you so much for that. We're going to move on now to Henry Theriault. So Henry is Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs. I should say Dr. Theriault is Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Worcester State University, a position he took after teaching in its philosophy department from 1998 to 2017. He coordinated WSU's Human Rights Center from 1999 to 2007. Specializing in continental philosophy and social and political philosophy, Theriault researches genocide denial, genocide prevention, post-genocide victim-perpetrator relations, reparations, and mass violence against women and girls. He has lectured around the world and published numerous journal articles and chapters. He is lead author of the Armenian Genocide Reparations Study Group's 2015 final report, Resolution with Justice. If folks have not read that, I highly suggest it. It's still so even more relevant maybe now. And with Samuel Totten, he's co-authored the United Nations Genocide Convention and Introduction, published by University of Toronto Press in 2019. Theriault's work has been published in English, Spanish, Armenian, Turkish, Russian, French, and Polish. In addition to various boards and committees in the field of genocide studies, Theriault served 2 terms as president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars from 2017 through 2021. He is founding co-editor of Genocide Studies International and co-edited IAGS's Genocide Studies and Prevention from 2007 to 2012. So welcome, Dr. Theriault, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Dr. von Joeden-Forgey, and thanks to the Lemkin Institute for this opportunity to discuss these important issues. And really thanks to the Lemkin Institute for really being a leader globally on these types of issues and really charting a course, I think, for meaningful, policy-oriented, human rights-oriented, ethically-oriented discussion and change. So thank you for all that. I'm going to try to share my screen and make sure I can get a slideshow going here. If you give me 1 second. Oh, this is not working. Hang on 1 second. I apologize for this issue. Hang on. Give me 1 second. I just got to figure out how to do this.
No problem.
Isn't it my usual incompetence with anything? Yeah. Okay. I think I got it. We tested it before. It worked great, and now it's not. So, okay, here we go. Can everyone see the first slide? Is that through? Okay, great. So just, I'm going to talk about sort of the overarching process of genocide by Turkey and now Azerbaijan. And keying on one of the sort of focuses of this panel, really try to look at lessons that we might learn, both regarding Armenians, but more broadly. And I think this case gives us a lot of food for thinking more broadly about minority and indigenous groups worldwide. I want to start. I'm actually at the University of Minnesota at a symposium on the Artsakh crisis right now. So I'll take the moment to acknowledge the Dakota people as the traditional stewards of this land and really recognize their relationship and the importance that we recognize that relationship. And I'm going to just jump right in. So the first lesson I would say we can take from what we've seen is that there is an overarching anti-Armenian elimination project that really has its roots in the 19th century. And we are now at 130 years of episodes of genocide aimed at the destruction of Armenians. And unfortunately, we're not seeing an end to that. And we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. If you look at different episodes, one of the things that is very clear is every period of genocide by Turkey and later Azerbaijan has been met, has allowed them perfect impunity. And in fact, the formation of the Turkish Republic was largely through a genocidal process against Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians. And eliminationist anti-Armenianism became embedded in the institutions, practices, and attitudes of all aspects of Turkish life, from sort of basic cultural kind of features to military institutions, political institutions, economic institutions, and so forth. We also see very interesting shifts. Azeris, even sort of before they could be defined as a people, going back more than 100 years, have engaged in mass violence, systematic mass violence against Armenians, really from the beginning of the 20th century in Baku and in other places. And we see all sorts of anti-Armenian measures, especially against Artsakh Armenians and other Armenians in Azerbaijan during the Soviet Union, for instance, de-development and other kinds of things that happened. And it was no shock that as Armenians in the late 1980s in Artsakh expressed a desire for self-determination in the face of this long oppression that included violence and also other measures for independence or joining to Armenia, that the result was a systematic ethnic cleansing campaign aided by the Soviet central government that mushroomed into a war. And again, from really the 1990s forward, you could argue, I had some debates with people, that the core of anti-Armenianism in some sense moved to Azerbaijan from Turkey, as strong as it still remains in Turkey, that sort of basis of anti-Armenianism, which we're considering a kind of racism or an analogy to racism, really sits there. And if you look at the kind of rhetoric, the development of honestly sickening textbook accounts of Armenians, teaching kindergarten students to hate Armenians. I mean, there are videos of this kind of stuff. It is really chilling that you see a kind of intense racism, even at the biological level and so forth. Fairy tales, now I've learned from scholars at this conference that I'm at, feature, even contemporary ones feature Armenians as monsters and so forth. I mean, this is deeply embedded stuff. And it's also state organized, which is also very important. This is not a fringe movement. This is something that's central to the identity of Azerbaijan as a state. And the impunity and rewarding of Azerbaijan, with wealth and status. It's now going to host the UN Climate Summit, shortly after its ethnic cleansing campaign against Armenians, is really horrible for Armenians and for the world generally, what it says about our lack of regard for human rights. And the other thing that's really important to understand is that Erdogan, Aliyev, and others in Turkey and Azerbaijan feel comfortable and frequently make explicit expressions of genocidal intent, of the intent to destroy Armenians, to wipe Armenians from the entire Caucasus region and as far beyond that as they can. And as any genocide scholar knows, getting blatant statements of intent is quite rare. You might see the Rwanda genocide and a few other cases where you see this, but most of the time, perpetrators are much more careful about the language they use. And the fact that that people in Turkey and Azerbaijan not only feel comfortable enough to espouse these views, but have these views should give us pause. And I'm thinking of how much this is also ignored. I was in a meeting with Bill Keating of Massachusetts 9th Congressional District shortly, about a month before or 3 weeks before the final assault on Artsakh. And he just kept dismissing, when we raised the genocidal intent, the fact that this is going to, there was going to be a military attack, all this kind of, kept dismissing it as, oh, that's just, rhetoric. We don't pay attention to that. No one really has this intent. And I think that should scare us a little bit. Second key point is reparations matter. For the victim group, this is not about abstract justice. This is about their ability to continue as a group into the future. Genocide and other kinds of mass violence is devastating. It destroys groups' economic, political, and other kinds of means of moving into the future. And it often entails demographic collapses that are debilitating in terms of the ability to function going forward. But also reparations entail rehabilitation of the perpetrator. And in the case of Turkey, that never happened. And that's why 100 years, literally 100 years after this massive genocide of 1915 to 23, Turkey could be an active military participant in renewed destruction of Armenians. Not only did the world community allow that, but Turkey itself was perfectly ready to do that. And I would argue that reparations should actually entail, and Carnegie suggested this himself in a very interesting way, should actually entail responsibility by perpetrator groups for the protection of the victim groups they have weakened through violence and so forth, And in fact, what we see is the exact opposite of that. And so the lack of reparations is part of why we are at the stage we are at, and why Armenians are in such a increasingly vulnerable position. I'm going to add one other point here. Victims who are victimized are seen as fit targets of violence after being victimized. Quite counterintuitively, we have all sorts of expression of concern, but the reality is, in not just the perpetrator's minds, but in the global community's minds, people who are identified as victims become sort of normalized victims. And when we see renewed violence against them, it is tolerated much more than it would be against groups who do not have histories of victimization. And I list different groups. You can think of this. Oh, Jews are under attack again. Well, of course they are, because that's what happens to Jews. Instead of thinking, my God, these are human beings who are under attack, whatever it is. And I think that we have to be very cognizant of this sort of implicit prejudice, because it is not only something that's embedded in perpetrator groups. They certainly see their past victims as future victims, but in other groups, and I'm just thinking about British and US rhetoric relative to Armenians in the last few years, and just how callously they have disregarded Armenian well-being, as if they just don't count as much as groups who are not typically victimized. I'm going to call this the damned of history, and this is just the reality. Some groups count and some don't. It's often a matter of geopolitics, economics, and other kinds of features. And I will say I listed 3 groups that have counted a lot in the last few years. Not their fault. They deserve to count. They deserve our support and so forth. But the effect of privileging a small minority of the groups who are under siege, who are under attack, and ignoring all the others or downplaying their victimization is devastating for those other groups. And ultimately, honestly, does not support even those privileged groups, because their support is often very hollow and really meaningless, and often more rhetorical than concrete. And I'll just give an example. The October 7 Hamas attack on Israel, and Israel's disproportionate response led to a sort of blackout, not just on the Artsakh issue, which was at its height, but on other issues as well. Renewed genocide in Darfur by Sudan, the Tigrayan crisis, in which 2 former enemies have ganged up on a minority group and are wreaking levels of casualties that are astounding and no one is talking about, and so forth. And I would just say, as a corollary, we have to understand the global political and legal order functions to really undermine human rights, and ultimately often works against the very rights it claims to espouse. I'm going to have a little pitch on Samantha Power. And I'm going to say this is a lesson I really took from this, and maybe this is a little bit harsh, but I really see her exposure as symptomatic of the sort of showing of the meaninglessness of human rights rhetoric in the US and in other great powers. She built a career on essentially exploiting genocide victim groups by claiming to be their sort of advocate against those in positions like hers who were indifferent to their suffering. And then when she was in a position to actually do something, maybe even resign multiple times from positions in a presidential administration, she not only did not do that, she allowed herself to be used for photo ops and other kinds of things. And I can get into her whole work as ultimately a career in obscuring US direct perpetration of genocide and complicity in genocide in dozens, if not more, cases, including, I would argue, things we are seeing today in Palestine. That her book actually basically omitted and covered up that whole history with this sort of very different kind of history of America's good intentions, but lack of ability to actually, or lack of resolve to deal with certain genocides that we were not directly involved in. Another lesson, and I know I'm closing in on coming out of time, is that perpetrators' genocidality spills over. If you look at Turkey, you start with Armenians and Greeks, you move to Assyrians, eventually to Kurds. If you look at Israel, it's very telling that Israel is a direct participant through weapon sales and its own actions against Armenians within its borders in a genocidal process of Armenians, even at the same time that the attack on Gaza and other Palestinian areas is happening. I would argue sometimes the U.S. is just looking for a genocide to participate in. I know that's unfair, but it almost sort of seems that way. If you look at Great Britain, it has complicity around the world, and I'm just thinking about British Petroleum as a key factor in the destruction of Armenians in Artsakh. You look at Russia, there are many other examples, but you start with Chechnya, Ukraine, the calculated allowing of genocide in Artsakh for its own political purposes, and we see that perpetrators don't just stop with one target group. This gets the last 3 points here. The internal diversity of targeted groups is destroyed by these kinds of processes. And as we probably know, Lemkin had many very important things to say about genocide that we still are unpacking and really understanding fully and putting into play in scholarship and policy circles in the ways that they should be. And I know Elisa has done some great work on him and gender and other aspects. And he really highlighted that genocide is a destruction for all of humanity because it takes a group that has an essential role in humanity away from humanity. And I would argue that genocide also functions that way internally to groups. It eliminates the internal complexity of groups, and it forces a kind of homogenization and reduction of those groups even when they survive. And you can think of how important that diversity is to cultural production and so much else. But you look historically, the elimination of Van Armenians, Nakhichevan Armenians, Artsakh Armenians, and we see the pressure in Georgia against Javak Armenians. We see what Sunni Armenians are facing now due to Azeri or Azerbaijan's invasion. And we see that this is actually slowly destroying what it is to be Armenian identity. And I think that's something we can't ignore. Territory matters. I know others will talk about this. Territory is not just disposable property, interchangeable with money and other territory. Territory matters because its geographical and topological features are part of the social and cultural relations and history and present of groups. The cultural artifacts and so forth are crucial to this. And in so many other ways, the specific land really does matter. We forget that sometimes. And I would argue that when you start to see, for instance, the environmental destruction that is now happening by Azerbaijan and Artsakh, that really is an extension of the physical destruction of human beings, of cultures, of societies, and so forth. And it's a little bit like when we talk about, the excess of violence, and Elisa has one of the greatest pieces in the history of genocide studies, Life Force Atrocities, and she talks about this excess of violence that manifests in sexualized violence and related kinds of family targeting violence. Here, I would argue as an analogy, we can also see this kind of excess in environmental destruction, because it's not enough just to kick the people out. It's not enough to destroy them. We want to go to the ultimate max of destruction. And my last big point is a big lesson of what we're seeing is the time Armenia has left as a viable political state. And I think Armenians as a people is going down. In 2015's Resolution with Justice, I predicted 50 years without reparative processes to help counter the overarching process of group dissolution that every victim group faces if they do not have a reparative process. After 2020, given what was happening and the kind of accelerated destruction, I reduced that to 20 years. After 2023, 10 years. And now in the last 6 months, I would say, looking at the overt intentional statements of intentionality of invasion and annexation of Armenian territory, we might be looking at just 2 years for the existence of an independent Armenia as the seat of Armenian identity in the world. I will just finish by saying Armenians are not alone. Anything I've said about the Armenian case, I've mentioned a few groups, but there are unfortunately dozens, if not hundreds of groups facing similar kinds of erasures that we are not talking about. And this is a real crisis, I think, globally. I think we are entering a horrible period of blatant renewed genocide, disregard for international law, disregard for basic ethics, and it is it is being accepted globally without without the kind of response we would assume is absolutely necessary. So thank you. Sorry for taking an extra minute or two, but I appreciate your attention.
Thank you so much, Henry, for those, I mean, really important 9 lessons. And if that isn't a call to action, I don't know what is, right? I'm very happy at the end that you said at the end, that you mentioned at the end, that in a way, a friend of mine put it to me this way, that the Armenians are often the canary in the coal mine, and what happened in Artsakh, you know, stands to be generalized in the 21st century as a way of dealing with problematic, so-called problematic populations around the world, especially since there's this language that allows this victimization and hides it beneath all sorts of obfuscation, which you also spoke about. So the stakes are really real. And I just want to thank you so much for underscoring that. And indeed, as the world is sort of being redivided in a new imperialism that we think about a lot at the Lemkin Institute, it's not hard to imagine that this will be used again and again unless we stop it now, working collectively. So thank you so much, Henry. And I want to welcome Mr. Artsakh Baglarian, who's been able to join us. Thank you so much, Artsakh, for being able to join us today. And I'd like to give you the floor next. So I'm going to introduce you first, however. Artsakh Baglarian is a genocide survivor from Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, who fled his ancient homeland in September 2023 due to the 9-month blockade, the aggression, and the genocide by Azerbaijan. Currently, he serves as the president of the newly established Union for the Protection of the Interests and Rights of the Artsakh People, which is a non-governmental organization. His work focuses on raising global awareness about the genocide and advocating for international justice and protection for his compatriots who are sheltered now in the Republic of Armenia. Previously, Mr. Baglarian held several high-ranking positions in the Republic of Artsakh. He was the Human Rights Ombudsman from 2018 to 2020, and the Chief of Presidential Staff from 2020 to 2021. In 2021, he served as the State Minister through 2022, the second position in the government, coordinating the activities of mostly humanitarian ministries. He holds a master's degree in politics, security, and integration from University College London, and a bachelor's degree in political science from the Yerevan State University. Additionally, he has studied public policy and administration at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Artsakh's personal experiences have deeply influenced his career. His father was killed in the war with Azerbaijan in the 1990s when Artsakh was just 4 years old, and he lost his eyesight due to a landmine explosion at the age of 6. These tragedies instilled in him a resilient spirit and a deep sense of responsibility to serve his people, advocate for peace, and uphold human rights. So it is truly a great honor, Mr. Baglarian, to have you here with us. Everybody who was watching in horror during the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, the 44-day war in 2020, knows the heroic way in which you have represented the interests of Artsakh Armenians. And we are very, very, very honored to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my honor to be with
Mr. Baglarian, for some reason you are muted. Can you unmute?
Okay,
Perfect.
sorry.
No problem.
Apologies for that. Okay, thank you very much. It's my honor to be here, to be with you, and thanks for your invitation. And apologies for joining you late. I had some issues. And thanks also to the Lemkin Institute for the great job, wonderful job for raising our voice and protecting our rights and the justice for our people and worldwide. That's why I would say that it's double honor for me to take part in such a conference organized by the Lemkin Institute. All right, as genocide survivor, I would present some facts to you. What happened, especially in September, why it's genocide, and then very shortly I will present my viewpoint, how we can reach the justice and how we can ensure the restoration of our collective rights in our homeland. Firstly, what happened in September, many people know the general context, but many details are not so known. And I would not discuss the previous developments, including 2020 war, the subsequent developments, and especially the blockade, because I guess there is a lot talked about that and written also by the Lemkin Institute. But I would just shortly say that the developments during the blockade were already showing the pattern of the Aliyev regime towards the Artsakh people, that their ultimate goal is full genocide and full displacement of our people from Artsakh. For sure, they wanted to reach their goal with minimum issues, minimum problems, if it's possible, even without any aggression, without any additional crimes. But they saw that the Artsakh people is just struggling for our rights, and we don't want subjugation, we don't want something which is against our will and against our rights, collective rights. And under the harsh conditions of the blockade, especially since June 15, when we didn't get any kind of supplies, medicine, food, anything, the Aliyev regime tried to exhaust the Artsakh people and the system, the army, pushing psychological terror towards the people, etc. And I would say that to some extent, it was efficient. I mean, in September already, under acute shortage of food, medicine, and other necessities, the psychological situation was already very tense among the people. And when on September 19, they started the full-scale aggression, it was clear that they had a goal to reach local siege, local blockade of different parts of Artsakh, different regions of Artsakh, in order to put different parts of our people under local siege, local blockade. It was true already on September 20 about Martakert region, a part of the Martakert region, the other part was already occupied. It was true about the entire Martuni region, cut off from other parts of Artsakh, Stepanakert. It was true about the other parts of the Shushi, the 4 villages of Shushi, and some parts of Askeran region. I mean, cut off from Stepanakert, from Martuni, etc., again occupied. And in addition to the crimes committed during the aggression, September 19 and 20, more than, like I would say more than 200 people was killed. Among them, at least 21 civilians, at least 6 children were killed, which means that within 24 hours, they killed more than 200 people. And it means that density of the aggression and the crimes was much, much more than the 2020, during the 2020 aggression, both among the civilians and among the military personnel. But what is also important that just after the aggression, I mean, upon the so-called ceasefire, there was a demand of disarmament of our army and dissolution of our state institutions. And there was no international guarantee for our security and for our governance. And there was no alternative for that. And our people saw that the army is disarmed, is getting disarmed, and the Russian peacekeepers are not protecting us, whether they are unable or they are not willing to do that. It doesn't matter in that regard. And we didn't get any kind of support from international community, especially the UN Security Council. And this was one of the main reasons why the people didn't feel safe and couldn't trust the Azerbaijani forces, because the Azerbaijani forces were committing crimes. For many years, there was a hatred propaganda, ethnic hatred propaganda against all Armenians. They were and they are unpunished for all the crimes previously committed, etc., etc. And in addition to that, we didn't have the self-governance or any kind of governance certainties, which means that our people didn't trust the Azerbaijani possible administration and felt that under Azerbaijani administration, everyone would be arrested, would be prosecuted, would be killed, humiliated, etc., and many kind of other crimes, like happened previously. But after a ceasefire, the Azerbaijani forces didn't stop at the positions where they promised to stop. And they continued their advancement to different kind of parts of Artsakh after September 20, and they continued the ceasefire violations. Also on September 21, September 22, 23, etc. I know tens of villages which have been occupied after the September 20 before our displacement. I mean, between September 20 and 25, 26. In addition to that, though they promised just after the ceasefire to restore the critical infrastructure, including electricity, gas supply, communication, because they cut off everything, including internet connection, mobile connection. They targeted the telecommunication system, the central antennas, etc. But also they targeted the local electricity production and supply system. And it was, I mean, the damaged parts were under Azerbaijani control, under Azerbaijani occupation already. But just after September 20, they didn't allow us to restore the electricity supply. Even when the army was fully disarmed, again, they didn't allow that. And they allowed the electricity supply to be restored only in the evening of September 24, just when the electricity system, the network was connected with the Azerbaijani system. I mean, they promised to restore the Armenian supply, but even without that, it was possible to restore the local production and local supply of electricity. But for 5 days, we didn't get any electricity, and we didn't have any stable, reliable communication. Because of these problems, the suffering, the deprivation of our people was much, much harsher than before the September 19. In addition to that, for a few days, even after the ceasefire, Azerbaijan didn't allow any supplies of food, medicine, gasoline, etc. Which means again that they continued to use food and other humanitarian necessities as weapons to push the suffering, to terrorize the people psychologically, and to push the people to the displacement, not to feel safe, etc. And under these harsh conditions, we had already more than 20,000 internally displaced persons from occupied villages, towns, or dangerous villages, communities, mostly in Stepanakert and in Ivanyan, around and in the airport. And everyone, I mean, many people, thousands of people were under open sky without anything. They even targeted the water system, the water supply system. And because of also the absence of electricity, the absence of oil, gasoline, the system didn't work, the water supply system, which means that the humanitarian tragedy was every day just becoming more and more brutal. Under these conditions, the hatred and terror propaganda was very intensive against our people, that we are coming to take our land, we are coming to arrest everyone. Even before the September 19, the Aliyev propaganda system was always saying that everyone, whoever ever fought against Azerbaijan since 1990s would be prosecuted and arrested. And because of these fears, just on and since September 20, there are many people, thousands of people, who were throwing their documents, I mean military documents, even photos, uniforms to the garbage, or were firing, I mean burning publicly or privately, not to have any kind of evidence showing their engagement in military service or in war activities against Azerbaijan. This showed the level of the terror and the level of the fears among the people to be killed, prosecuted, arrested, humiliated, etc. And many other examples. I know what happened, how happened, and why our people just forcibly displaced. And it was pushed, I mean, this environment, coercive environment, was deliberately pushed by the Aliyev, genocidal Aliyev regime, knowing that the result will be full displacement of our people, because our people didn't have any kind of other choice. Another example was the arrestments of our leaders, political or leaders, which means that they wanted to behead also the community, the people, and to punish the leaders for their political struggle for our political rights and collective rights. And this is also an example of genocidal intent of the Aliyev regime. And I was, based on my information, I was also wanted by the Aliyev regime, but luckily they couldn't abduct me or arrest me, and I escaped such kind of arrestment. It showed that they wanted firstly to punish anyone, any voice, any leader who struggled against Azerbaijan, but also secondly, they wanted to prevent any kind of further struggle or further mobilization of our people for the struggle of for our rights, collective rights. There were many other factors that we can decide, but these were the key factors affected the forced displacement of our people and the full genocide. What's happening now? Azerbaijan, the Aliyev regime, wants to destroy and eradicate the millennia cultural heritage and traces of Armenian people and Christians in Artsakh, which is a part of their genocidal policy. But secondly, they now try to populate Artsakh and using our houses, using our property there. And there are also already examples that they distracted not only the cultural heritage and cemeteries of our people, but also the private property, houses, apartments, businesses, etc. And what we should do or we can do, the first strategic goal that the international community should do, or everyone, whoever is caring about our people and caring about the humanity and the international law, is firstly to recognize and condemn the genocide against our people. This is the first thing that we should do. And we should reject the denialism, the genocide denialism. And we should fight the denialism because countries, the governments, make political decisions and they don't want to take responsibility because recognizing genocide means that they failed to protect our people, they failed to prevent the genocide. But on the other hand, recognition and condemnation of the genocide will mean that the international community has responsibility to restore our rights, to punish the criminals, restore the justice or protect the justice, and also to ensure, as the primary right, to ensure our collective return to our homeland and safe, dignified, and self-determined or sovereign life in our homeland. Why? Because we have two pillars of this life, safe, dignified, and sovereign life. The first pillar is our right to self-determination. The second pillar is remedy or prevention of the genocide or for the genocide. Remedy for the genocide, prevention of a new genocide or new international crime, which means that we need international protection mechanisms and the highest mechanisms given by the UN Security Council. Without this kind of protection mechanisms, I don't believe that our people will return because there is no hope, there is no trust, there is no chance that under Azerbaijan, any kind of Azerbaijani rule, it's possible to live there. We know that if we are going there, everything can happen there. On the other hand, another thing that we should push the international community is eradication or dismantling of the Azerbaijani ethnic hatred policy against all Armenians, which is the #1 ideological ground for the crimes since 1990s. And without dismantling this ethnic hatred policy system, it's impossible not only to restore our rights in Artsakh, but also to reach sustainable and durable peace with Armenia and with Armenians. This should be addressed by so-called peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Without addressing this issue and without addressing our collective return issue, it's impossible to have long-term peace and justice in the region, in South Caucasus. These are the main topics that I would say, I mean, actually three ones, if we can separate. The first one is recognition and condemnation of the genocide. The second one is our collective return, together with our further life there, safe, dignified, and sovereign life. And the third one is dismantling of the Aliyev or Azerbaijani ethnic hatred system against all Armenians. Sorry, it was long. Thank you. I'm ready to answer any questions if it's possible.
Artsakh, thank you so much. Mr. Baglarian, pardon me. Thank you so much for laying out for us, number one, the kind of genocidal dimensions of what has happened in the Republic of Artsakh in Nagorno-Karabakh, and then also articulating these three very important points about what needs to happen next, particularly recognizing the genocide against the Artsakh Armenians, who are a distinct identity group that over 3,000 years old and who have always, in one way or another, ruled over themselves under various empires, and even under the Soviet Union as an autonomous oblast. People forget that, that this is a very distinct community you're talking about and that you come from, and that it has always in one way or another self-governed. And even before the genocide in Artsakh in September, Freedom House in the United States, it was a democracy in Artsakh. I don't know if everybody watching knows that. And Freedom House ranked it 30 points, I think, higher than Azerbaijan, which is not hard to do since Azerbaijan is an authoritarian, a very strict authoritarian dictatorship. But I think that's something that needs to be recognized as well, that this was a free, sovereign community with the institutions of government that were democratically elected. So thank you so much for that. We're going to move on to our other speakers and then open up for Q&A. We're running a little bit late, so I'm hoping that our attendees and the speakers who can will stay a little bit longer, so that maybe we can get to at least one or two questions. We're going to move on to Mr. Stephen Sim, who will talk about sort of a broader perspective on this ongoing cultural destruction in the region. And then we will end with Dr. Gzoyan. So let me introduce Mr. Sim. Stephen Sim is based in Scotland, is an independent researcher with a particular interest in the architecture of historical Armenia and how recent history and politics has impacted its preservation. He has traveled extensively in Eastern Turkey since the 1980s, during which he has taken some 150,000 photographs of Armenian monuments and related structures. In 1999, responding to troubling archaeological interventions at the deserted medieval Armenian city of Ani, he created the website virtualani.org, and I highly suggest everybody look that up. He has given presentations about Ani and about Armenian architecture in London, Boston, Montreal, Los Angeles, and New York, as well as online events. In 2005, on behalf of Research on Armenian Architecture, he visited Azerbaijan's Nakhchivan region to assess the conditions of its Armenian monuments. He was part of the October 2006 delegation to Paris that met with Koichiro Matsuura, Director General of UNESCO, to protest that organization's inaction over the destruction of Juga's medieval cemetery. In 2007, he contributed to a photographic exhibition held in Cambridge, Massachusetts about Nakhichevan's destroyed Armenian architectural heritage and was part of a related panel discussion event at NAASR in Belmont. In the mid-2010s, he collaborated with Ani Hovhannisyan on a documentary using material filmed in Turkey in 2014. In 2019, The Hidden Map, the title of the documentary, premiered at various film festivals. It's an excellent documentary. I highly suggest it to all of our listeners. So thank you very much, Mr. Sim, for being with us and for sharing your observations over the years. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the Lemkin Institute for inviting me today. I put together a presentation at rather short notice, so it's a bit rough, and I haven't got any script, so I'm just going to ad-lib my way through it. I'll just maximize the screen. One moment. So I need to screen share first, don't I? Yeah.
Great.
Okay, and slideshow from the beginning. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this subject, basically how the Armenian genocide and its denial has impacted negatively the preservation of Armenian cultural remains in present-day Turkey and Armenia. The "and Armenia" part might surprise some people. I'd intended to say more about that, but I haven't had time to get together the photographs, so I'll just mention that at the very end. Okay, so this was a book which I purchased in a second-hand bookshop in the late 1970s, and at the time I was looking for somewhere interesting to travel.
Sorry for interrupting. Somehow the image has not advanced on our screens.
Oh,
I don't
so
know.
have
Maybe
anything now?
no. Are you clicking on that image?
I am, yes, I'm using the right and left buttons.
Yeah.
So are you seeing that screen with the title?
We're seeing the title screen. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
You
Anything
might
now?
need to put it in slideshow.
Okay. Wait a minute. I'll get back to. Well, it wasn't slideshow. Setup slideshow.
From beginning. You did click from beginning, didn't you?
Yes. I'll try from the current slide.
Let's try. Okay.
Anything there?
It's just showing the title slide again.
Um,
Maybe not have it and go home instead of slideshow and advance it that way. That might work. There we go. Let's see.
I could probably do it like this.
Oh, yeah.
Though you're still seeing the blue. Does
Yeah.
that? No, it's not. It's not working at all now. It's not. It is not moving forward.
Oh, also for you?
Oh, wait a
Oh,
minute.
now it's moving. Yes. You got
Yeah.
it.
So maybe
Yeah.
I'll use the. I'll try it with the slideshow, but using the mouse
Okay.
scrolling button. That might be the. Slideshow.
Great.
Is that working? How's it going forward?
No, we just see the title slide. It was working there for a second.
Sorry about this.
No, no
So it
problem.
looks like I'll have to do it like this.
Yeah.
So it's working now.
Yes, now it's working.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. It's funny, these things still happen on Zoom, but they happen to me all the time.
Okay, so that's the title. And so this was a book that I purchased, I think it was about 1981, when I was thinking of somewhere interesting to go in the world. Turkey seemed to be the furthest away the nearest furthest away place that I could travel to. And perhaps because the eastern part of Turkey was the furthest away part of that nearest faraway place, I decided to start there. So this was a 2-volume book. There weren't many books about Turkey, guidebooks about Turkey in the 1980s, because there was a military coup in Turkey, and basically no one was going there, and that meant the guidebook market dried up. So this was a book published in 1974, and it is a translation of a French guidebook from the 1960s. And it describes a monastery called Kutzkonk, magnificent complex of 5 churches, and describes their location and their names and what they look like. And it was with this description that I went to the site expecting to see something similar to what was described. And when I got there, I didn't see 5 churches. I just saw the one church, and that one church was heavily damaged with large gashes in its side. So my interest in Armenian architecture sort of started with my observation of its destruction. And that's what the site used to look like. So they are the 4 of the 5 churches. And the 5th church was this one. And that's what's left of the 5th church today. So it was the fact of the destruction of this site was what prompted me to take an interest in Armenian architecture, which is the exact opposite of what the destroyers would have intended. This site was probably destroyed in the mid to late 1950s, but there's no exact dates for most of the destruction that's been going on. Some of the destructions took place during the First World War, and in that sense, it's probably sort of understandable that it happened. This is a church that was in Erzincan. This is what it looked like when the Russians captured the place around about 1916. So these are Russian soldiers examining the aftermath of the genocide in Erzincan. And the photo on the right is the bell tower in the Sub Grigor Church in Diyarbakir, which was rebuilt in the 2000s, I believe, though not to that same design and not as tall. So this was symbolically demolished in 1915 by the local Turks as a sign that the Armenian community in Diyarbakir was finished. But in the years after the First World War, reports slowly began to emerge of what was happening to Armenian monuments in Turkey. The whole of Eastern Turkey was a military zone until 1950, and nobody could travel there. So there's a report in a French magazine from March 1922. It mentions it mentions several sites by name, including the Ani Museum and islands on Lake Van and some of the monasteries in the Van area. One of the reasons that the report is given credibility by the magazine is that the destruction of the Ani museums was already documented. So there were 2 Ani museums at the Ani archaeological site. There's a better known one, which was in the Manuka Mosque, which is this photograph in the middle, and there's a lesser known museum, which was a stone carvings museum, which is towards the left side of the city. So the photograph on the right is of the interior of the stone museum. And this was the condition of the stonework museum in 1921. And the French journalists knew that this was a factual event because Nikolai Marr, who excavated at Ani, he gave a presentation in Paris in 1920 about this, about what had happened to the museum. So the modern photograph shows the same view today. So that's not even recognized that the museum was ever here. Tourists just walk past it, not knowing what it was, and it's not listed in any of the guidebooks to Ani or any of the signposts that exist at Ani. And you can still see a few of the original stone fragments of stone artifacts that the museum held. They're still lying on where the floor was. This is a book published in in Britain. It's published in I think I have it here. One moment, check the date of it. But in France, it was written in 1939 and published post-war. 1947, but it takes place in 1939, and the author was traveling through eastern Turkey to assess the quality of the wool that the sheep were producing. The French army was rearming and re-equipping itself in expectation of the Second World War, and so they were looking for new sources of wool for uniforms, and the author was sent to eastern Turkey to assess what the sheep were like. So he went to this he went to Old Van, which is depicted on the cover there, and he also went to some of the thriving Armenian churches. This is called Sir Bartholomeos. And while he was there, he talked with the local, it was in the middle of an army base, and he talked with the local commandant, who talked about how he wanted to destroy the church, and the only thing that was stopping him destroying it was his lack of high explosives. But he had already damaged a lot of it with grenades and just normal pickaxes and hammers. But he was anticipating getting more explosives, and that soon he'd be able to destroy it completely. And this is the same building today. And a lot of this destruction is certainly done by high explosives. Although I don't think it happened in 1939 or 40 or during the Second World War. I think a lot of the destruction of the Armenian churches in eastern Turkey happened in the post-war years when explosives became very cheap, and you almost couldn't really give them away. They were so common as war surplus. And I think a lot of the churches were destroyed at this time when there was a plentiful supply of high explosives. And this is the demolition of the Armenian Cathedral of Erzurum. I found these two photographs on a Turkish equivalent of eBay. I didn't actually buy them because you can't buy from the company outside of Turkey. They're not dated, but I think they're from the 1950s because you can see that the paintwork inside the cathedral is starting to flake away. So it's not something that happened in the 1920s or 30s. And just also the general look of the people looks as if it comes from the 1950s. So the left photo is what it was like before the genocide with the bell tower. The bell tower has already been destroyed by the time of the final demolition. So many of the Armenian churches probably were quietly got rid of in a similar way. So that's why there are no Armenian churches left in the centers of any of the towns in eastern Turkey. So in Erzurum, there are none. In Erzincan, there are none in Sivas, none in Kars, and so on, or Van. And churches that weren't demolished tended to be misrepresented as something else. So this is the Armenian church in the abandoned town of Old Palu near Mush, and it's described as a Byzantine church with a very broad date to it, somewhere between 475 and 1453. They say it was built. So really, they're just doing anything rather than mention Armenian. It's actually a 19th century Armenian church. So in 2007, in the 2000s, there began to be a gradual change in Turkish attitudes towards Armenian monuments. The core attitude didn't change, but the EU wanted Turkey to make some example restorations of Armenian and Greek monuments in Turkey as a display of Turkey's supposed tolerance and modernity. This was to encourage people in the European Union to stop objecting to a possible Turkey's membership of the EU. So the Akdamar church was restored and reopened and international diplomats and journalists were invited to come, but no archaeologists were invited. It was just a political event rather than a cultural event. And the restoration itself was a very heavy-handed and altered the original structures in a number of ways. For example, the original roof was grass, so the grass roof was destroyed, and this historically inaccurate stone pitched roof was put in its place. This window here also didn't exist originally, so it's put there so that the interior was better lit. And everything has been scrubbed clean of any history. And that's a common theme with all of the restorations that have been happening in Turkey. It's as if they want to scrub the buildings clean of their history. So these are examples of what I call destruction by restoration. This is a church in Van. The before is on the left and the after is on the right. There's nothing left of the original church. None of these original stones are surviving in the original in situ position. So maybe the floor plan is slightly similar to what was there before, but it has destroyed the original building. And the original building never had a flat roof like that. It was a gentle curve with a grass top. And you can see similar examples of these sort of restorations throughout Turkey. This is another church, also in Lake Van. It's near Edremit. So that's the before on the left. These are photographs taken by Armin Arayan, and that's what it looks like now. Again, it's got an artificial flat roof. It was originally a sort of barrel-shaped grassed roof, and this door is nothing like what it would have looked like originally. There's another restoration taking place in 2013. It's a church in Kayseri, St. Mary's Church. It was originally a church. Then after the genocide, it became a gymnasium. And there are pictures where you can see the interior is filled with trampolines and various sporting equipment and training equipment. So in 2013, that was closed, and it's now a cultural centre with a library. However, in that conversion, it has lost a lot of its meaning. Before, in its state as a sports hall, it was, in a way, a monument to the Armenian genocide. But in its current state, where it's all cleaned up and looking newly built, the important parts of its history have been removed. So often restoration really means a cleansing of a building of its inconvenient post-genocide history. So that's what originally there's an Armenian inscription underneath this, and they're gradually uncovering it. And it's in its current state, the inscription is completely uncovered, and it looks like it has never been covered. But by the removal of all of the signs of what happened to it in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on, and an important section of that building's history has been destroyed. And I think that some of that history needs to be preserved. So really just what I'm photographing it like at that moment shows more about what's happened to this building than either its before or its after condition shows. You've also got this very, it probably sounds better in German. It's an inscription by Kant, but this means discipline is greater than culture. In the Turkish translation, it's much cruder than the original German, but it's also maybe more appropriate to Turkish militaristic attitudes. Here's a Van Archaeological Museum that was opened in 2021. It replaces a Van museum that was in the center of Van, which was quite interesting because if you go to Turkish museums and you want to see Armenian things, you won't find them inside. You'll find them in the back, in the gardens, hidden away at the back of the building. And that was the case with the Van Museum that was in the city. Well, in the new museum, there's almost nothing there of our Armenian culture or Armenian artifacts left on display. So that's what is there. It's been described as the Armenian corridor. And it's just, there's basically 6 things of Armenian identity on display. And 7th is a door on the entrance to the corridor. And the things that are on this display there, they're Assyrian. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things. It's called the Armenian period, but these things date from this one's an 11th century Kashgar, and these are the end. These are 18th and 19th century things. So as a period, is the Turkey would like to think that it's just the period is just the period when Akhtamar was built, maybe the 9th or 10th century. So they are, but they have these things which accidentally show that the Armenian period lasted right up until 1917, really. But the actual demolition and destruction of Armenian sites is still continuing. This is a graveyard site near Muradye. Sorry, it's a misspelling there. It should be Muradye in the northeastern corner of Lake Van. And I've made lots of visits to this place, maybe 20, something like that. So there's the 2 churches on the site, and there's also a graveyard. It's probably the largest Armenian religious site that exists. It takes about maybe 40 minutes to walk between all of the sites, and they're connected with old pathways and trails. So the graveyard hasn't been documented by anyone. There's been nothing published about it. So this was it in the 2000s and 2010s. It's very much disturbed by people coming and digging for treasure, but essentially a lot of the stones were still surviving. So that's me in various visits in summer 2001 and winter 2002. So here's a photograph taken, well, a view of Google Earth. Let me just move it to, I can't see the date, unfortunately, because of your screen. September 2019. Okay. So that's a graveyard site here. And you can see the vague outline also of the trails that link the various parts of the monastery site. So that this trail goes down here, and there's a church just outside the picture, outside the view. Again, that's the original route up to that church, and the road winds around here, and then it comes here, and then winds its way up to another church higher up. So that's the last satellite view of the graveyard in its intact state. And if we move over to October 2021, we see these changes. a new road has been cut up towards the graveyard site. The graveyard itself has been destroyed, and they also have this excavation here, which is actually a sort of small quarry site where they took earth and stones and moved them from here to completely cover the graveyard site. So that's what the graveyard looks like now. It's completely, all of the stones have been removed, and the site has been covered over with rubble. Here's a close up. So none of these stones are actually from this particular location. They've been taken from if I go back, they've been taken from here and then carted or over and dumped here. This is very similar to what happened in Nakhichevan with destroyed Armenian sites there, where Azerbaijan covered the site with earth to make it appear that there was never anything there. So wait maybe 10 or 15 years, and this will look just like a natural hillside with no remains of the cemetery visible. And that's where the earth was taken from. And quite unbelievably. It's reported in the Turkish press. This is how they're excusing the road that was cut up to the destroyed cemetery. So the road that they built to destroy the cemetery is described as an access road for tourism, so that visitors can go to one of the surviving churches more easily. But there is no road that goes up to the church. It's a completely fake story, released by the official news agency of the Turkish state, the Anadolu agency. There's a more sophisticated way of destroying a building rather than just demolishing it. What you do is you hasten its destruction by nudging it on its way to collapse, by sabotaging key structural elements. I found this in lots of buildings in eastern Turkey, but you only really notice it if you're making repeat visits to the same building. So this is another church in the Lake Van area. It's possibly the oldest church in surviving that's still got its roof on it, the oldest Armenian church that's still surviving. And there's been one of the pilasters here has been dug into to attempt to collapse the roof. And this is another monastery also in Lake Van, where you can see all these various stones have over the years been removed. So this may have happened 1 year, and that another year, and this another year. So it's a consecutive cumulative effect of gradually weakening the church until it reached a stage that it will collapse. So if I could go back over the years, I would be able to see what years each of these little bits of damage done. But unless you're making these repeat visits, you don't realize that this sort of damage has happened. And here's another example of the same thing near Kayseri. It's a monastery called Hulavank. And there's bits of damage all over the place, which a casual visitor might not notice. And a repeat visitor, only a one-off visitor would not realize is deliberate. So this sort of damage isn't something a treasure hunter would do. They just dig out under the floors. They don't make structural sabotage like this, because they wouldn't want the building to fall down on their heads, and there wouldn't be any treasure they would think that would be hidden in there. So this is a deliberate sabotage intended to hasten the destruction of the building. And in this case, it was effective because that's the monastery today. It collapsed when that was 2019, so it collapsed in 2018. It's another view. And I also wanted to mention something about the situation in Armenia. So we've got a statement there, a quote by the Soviet Armenian architect Temanyan. He's a man who designed most of modern Yerevan. So while he was designing it, he made this quote that his designs were intended to erase and forget the time when Armenians were slaves under Muslim rule. Now, he was mostly just referring to his designs for Yerevan, and he wanted Yerevan to become a European-style capital. But the same ideology has spread really throughout Armenian society, and it has resulted in the destruction of a large part of Armenians' own cultural history. The old travelers to Armenia would often mention that the churches had been fortified, and you can see a lot of old photographs that have towers added onto the churches, or the roofs have been raised to make them almost like defensive keeps, European style keeps. And every example that existed in Armenia has been destroyed to return the church to what the local population thinks is a sort of a golden age depiction of Armenia, something which never really existed. And you get the same contempt of Armenia's past. So there's never been any studies of Armenian villages. There are no medieval houses left in Armenia because they've all been demolished during the Soviet era. And Armenia also suffers from the same destruction by restoration of its historical monuments that you can see in Turkey, with over-restored and often altered churches. And if you look at Facebook pages where people post pictures of Armenian churches, if one's in ruins, you'll get suddenly, inevitably, dozens of Armenians decrying that the condition, the saying it's an embarrassment and shame on the nation, and the churches need to be rebuilt. So here's an example. There are hundreds of examples like this in Armenia. So essentially, this building has been destroyed as an historical monument. Nobody really says anything about it in Armenia. Another problem is that in the 1990s, the Armenian church was given ownership of hundreds of Armenian churches that were previously owned by the state or confiscated by the Soviet state. And under Armenian law, the Armenian church can do whatever it wants with the monuments it owns. It doesn't need planning permission, and it doesn't need to discuss or get advice from conservationists. And if we've got time, just one other thing I'd like to mention about Eastern Anatolia. We hear this word a lot, and it is even used by Armenians, and I've seen Armenian authors use the phrase to refer to regions and buildings in Lake Van. However, Eastern Anatolia itself is a completely modern concept. It was coined in the 1930s, and it has its aim, really, the elimination of Armenia as a distinct place and as a proper region, and the reduction of Armenians to just one of many minorities that once existed in this large region called Anatolia. So here's the first modern map of Turkey by William Fadden, published in 1785. We see here on the left Anatolia, and here on the right it says Armenia. And Turkey's Eastern Anatolia region is really just identical to the territory of historical Armenia, and it's designed to replace it in maps and also in literature, including academic literature. And in that respect, they've been almost completely successful. So nobody ever calls this historical Armenia anymore. It's even Armenians refer to as Eastern Anatolia. So in that sense, the cultural genocide has been completely successful. There are still lots of churches around, but they're in varying degrees of destruction, or they've been just completely cleansed of their past history and are presented as monuments of tolerance and as cultural centers. And in Armenia proper, as if there were not already enough destruction of Armenian churches, Armenia itself is doing its bit as well, in my opinion, to destroy the past. So I think I might have succeeded this time limit a little bit, so I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stephen, for this incredible presentation and these amazing photographs that really drive home the extent to which, the genocide is ongoing, the landscape is part of this genocide, and that, genocide in this region as elsewhere is very much about the complete elimination, the complete erasure of identities, in this case, the Armenian identity, including the erasure of any semblance of a past on a certain land. So the destruction of cemeteries, right, museums and churches, other monuments, but also the destruction of language and the use of language then to erase people as well. I think this point about Eastern Anatolia is really great. It's often used because it's considered more objective than something like historical Armenia or Western Armenia.
Well, nobody at any point in their time has ever called themselves an Anatolian.
Exactly.
It doesn't exist as an ethnicity.
But you're right. So that's such a great, it's a great way to erase an ethnicity, to come up with some, quasi scientific geographic term that serves then to destroy this history in one fell swoop. And so much of what we're seeing in this region is precisely this use of language to destroy Armenian heritage as well as Armenian people. So thank you. I mean, so much. I really think that seeing your photos is just so instructive. And I want to thank you so much for sharing them with us here and your long-term engagement with this problem. It's fantastic. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Thanks for everyone for being with us. And I want to introduce our last speaker, but certainly not our least speaker, Dr. Edita Gzoyan, who is the new director of the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute Foundation. I want to congratulate you, Dr. Gzoyan, for that new position. And we know you're going to do wonderful, wonderful things there. She's also a leading researcher at the Department of the Study of the Oppression of the Armenians of Artsakh, Nakhchivan, and Azerbaijan at the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute Foundation. Her main fields of research are legal and historical aspects of the Armenian genocide and the Artsakh issue, the history of the First Armenian Republic, and scientometrics. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Okay, so Dr. Gzoyan has published dozens of articles in national and international journals and authored and co-authored 3 books. So amazingly prolific. Among her latest articles is From War Crimes to Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide, Turkish Responsibility After World War I, that was published in Genocide Studies International in 2023. She is an assistant editor of, I am going to, Edita, you're going to have to pronounce that for me. How can you pronounce that, please?
Ցեղասպանագիտական հանդես.
Thank you very much. So that journal, as well as, I'm working on my Armenian, but I'm not that far along, as well as the International Journal of Armenian Genocide Studies. Dr. Gzoyan, we are so happy to have you here and so honored to have you here, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa, for this invitation. The pleasure is mine to participate in this panel. And also I would like to start with thanking the Lemkin Institute, for those who are living outside of Armenia. You are doing a great job. For us, you are doing a practical job. So we are really very thankful for what you have done and are doing for Armenians living in Armenia, and also those who are living in, unfortunately, who are left Artsakh. So because we are running our time, I will try to be very short. Actually, my thoughts will be in a way summarizing what our co-panelists have already mentioned. As Elisa has presented, I am from the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute, the institute that is also in charge of the Armenian Genocide Memorial. So we are on the territory that combines the past with the present. How it combines, I don't know if, I'm not sure that everyone knows, on the territory of the Armenian Genocide Museum, we have several items that are graves and khachkars, 3 khachkars that are connected to the Nagorno-Karabakh Artsakh issue. So when we are presenting the memorial to our guests, to official delegations, we always make this emphasize and this connection between the Armenian genocide and the Artsakh issue, how the non-recognition of the genocide and also the denial of the Armenian genocide resulted in a new wave of violence against the Armenians. So what has happened during the violence that erupted after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the violence against the Armenians in several cities of Azerbaijan, mainly in Baku, Sumgait, and Ganzak. 3 Hajj cars were brought and erected on the territory of the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute, in a sign that this is the continuation of the Armenian genocide. What I want to mention here is that there is no governmental involvement in those actions, and like ordinary people who were rallying on April 24 at the beginning of 1990s, they just brought this Hajj cars and put on the territory of our memorial. And we have also 5 graves of the freedom fighters who were among the first victims of Nagorno-Karabakh, the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. And again, they are buried on the territory of the Genocide Museum, Genocide Memorial, again showing this connection between these 2 events. What I want to stress here is when we are speaking about the anti-Armenian violence and Armenophobia that comes after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But because now we are also researching the period of Soviet Azerbaijan and Soviet Armenia, I want to assure you that violence and discrimination were also there. So this is not something new. We have the roots starting from the beginning of the 20th century, like 1905, the violence that erupted in Baku, in Shushi, and then we have this whole period of Soviet dominance when we have political, economic, and also ethnic violence against the Armenians. Also, it was very well hidden by the Soviet government and by the Soviet Azerbaijani government, and also by the help of the Armenian Soviet government, but the violence was there. So it was not like erupted in one day. After Armenians of Artsakh, they wanted to be reunited with their mother Armenia. So why those Hajj cars and graves are there? Because people found a lot of similarities between the violence that was perpetrated against the Armenians during the Armenian genocide, and also like during those years of collapse that the violence erupted against the Armenians. And just I want to bring a quote of one of the men whom we interviewed and who was a survivor of Baku massacres. He said, like, I have some Azeri friends and they said that you are a good man, but you are an Armenian. So we are going to expel you and like inflict some violence against you. So again, we are dealing with an identity issue. Like Armenians were not considered as a threat or something like that. Armenians were expelled, Armenians were killed, murdered because they were Armenians. And this is how the Azeris understand Armenian ethnicity there. And because like Turkey always backing Azerbaijan in minds of the people, this was another reason, another connection between those 2 events. And unfortunately, during this 2020 war and also this last events, we that witnessed the similarities of violence against, and I will bring 2 examples, like cutting their victims, raping Armenian women. It was like during the genocide, and we have witnessed it during this violence against Armenians by Azeris. And also like this, like taking photos of the victims and then killing them, or killing them and videotaping it and then showing it. It's something that makes similarities between the Armenian genocide and the Artsakh issue. Like, this is our perspective, the Armenians, the victims who consider what is happening and what has happened to be a continuation of the genocide. But I want to emphasize here that the perpetrators, the Azeris and Turks in this case, they also have this vision that they are committing a genocide, and they are mocking, and they are using these words as if we are using it for our purposes. And they like don't cover. Then if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Kevonyan has mentioned that we don't have this secrecy of genocide and the plan and the genocidal mind of the perpetrators. So they are openly arguing, they are openly showing that they have this hatred and Armenophobia, and they will kill Armenians. And I want to state here that this is a state organized project. Actually, this rhetoric of violence and hatred and animosity comes from the government, from the president, and it goes down to the public. So when we are researching the Azeri social media and also their press and different programs, we see that it is working, and it is working very well. So this violence and Armenophobia is from the bottom to the top and from the top to the bottom. So the society is full of anti-Armenianism. And I was shocked actually by one of the social media posts when a photo of Armenian child was being circulated in Azerbaijani social media. And like the question was asked, what will you do with this child if you find out that he or she is an Armenian? And you cannot imagine what kind of violence and the methods of killings were written by ordinary Azeris, by ordinary girls and boys who were like students, who were teachers. So the society is full with this hatred. And we have discussed today that genocide is not about physical annihilation. It's about the destruction of identity. And as Mr. Sim has showed, like this cultural destruction, we are witnessing the same cultural destruction in the case of Azerbaijan. But like you have mentioned the word sophisticated, Azeris are much more sophisticated now because they are not destroying, they are not demolishing, they are not changing, they are changing the history. They are changing the owners of these churches, of these monasteries. They are inventing a history. And the aim of this invention is to erase the Armenian trace from our historical land. And one last maybe similarity with the Armenian genocide, like this is what I'm quoting usually, that in like after the Berlin and San Stefano treaties, when the international community, they decided to leave the protection and guarantees of the rights of the Armenians in the hands of the Turks, the end was the Armenian genocide. And like in this case, when the international community, they decided to give this protection and guarantees of the rights of Artsakh people to the Azeri government, we have this forced displacement and genocide against the Armenians of Artsakh. And like we as genocide scholars, I think we have to concentrate and raise maybe two issues that came to my mind. First is the concept of genocide by attrition. Actually, it was raised by Helen Fine, and it needs to be developed further, because what is happening to the Armenian nation now living in Armenia as well, this is a genocide by attrition, because they are taking our lands part by part. They are expelling us from our historical lands, from our country, from our motherland. So we are under the constant threat of annihilation. And this is resulting in this genocide by attrition. And also, we are never speaking about the right to land. Like, we are speaking about the human rights, but we are never raising the issue of the right to land. Maybe in the context, in the frame of the rights of indigenous people, but these voices are actually being silenced. But people not living on their land, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, for them to retain and to maintain their identity. And I am done with this. Thank you so much.
Edita, thank you so much for that very powerful presentation that was actually a wonderful summary and conclusion of our entire day here together today. Thank you so much. And I think you well underscored a couple really important points. One of them being that the international community is, repeating past mistakes when it comes to Armenians and is deeply complicit in what is happening. And that complicity, there needs to be accountability for that complicity. I would love to see the crime of complicity
It seems like we lost Dr. Forgey with her Wi-Fi, so while we give her time to connect, we're going to go ahead and move into our Q&A. We've had some really great questions asked, and I see a couple of our speakers have already been answering these questions and starting the discussion. So I'm just going to jump right in and start going through some of these questions. We have one question. Diaspora says right of return. Yerevansis appear indifferent or uninformed, and the Armenian government is not able to negotiate with the enemy and is giving up more territory. How do we, as a people, work effectively in this environment when everyone is not on the same agenda? And I'll open it up to, sure. Go ahead and start.
I don't mind taking a stab at a charged question like that, so I will. First of all, I think we have to understand that peace treaties do not stop genocidal regimes. This is an axiomatic point. It has never worked. We know this from World War II. This is giving Hitler Sudetenland did not stop him. This is the whole Neville Chamberlain versus Winston Churchill approach to stopping genocidal regimes. So peace treaties are not going to stop genocidal regimes. This is, and frankly, if we're not fighting for the Artsakh people's right of return under international protection and presence today, we will be speaking of the rights of the Sunni Armenians or the Taguch Armenians very soon. And I think Professor Theriault's, timetable is quite noteworthy in this respect. We contribute to this by using narratives and approaches that really kind of facilitate what is happening. With respect to what the diaspora should be doing in this particular instance, well, the truth of the matter is the rights of the Artsakh people, the rights of the Armenian people will survive governments. Will survive the government in Yerevan, will survive the government in Baku, will survive the government in Ankara. So we need to lay the foundations. I'm not a big fan of the defeatist approach to these things because, yes, we see the very troubling reality that we're in, and yes, from a kind of step-by-step microcosmic level, there are decisions being made that further make the rights that we're talking about than the value of territory, as Professor Gzoyan mentioned a second ago, as so critical, that jeopardize the territorial aspect to this as well. There is a lot to be done now. It's really in our hands. There's no reason why the outcome of the second Armenian genocide needs to look like the outcome from the first Armenian genocide. We have a state, and yes, there are compromises that are intolerable, and there are compromises that are very difficult to deal with in this present state. But we also have what we have on the screen. We have international scholars and international influencers, lawyers, politicians that have a lot more sophistication and understanding about the aspects of genocide and how to prevent and how to reverse certain aspects of genocidal processes. So really, the outcome post September 19th is in our hands too. We have an obligation to speak out, like this panel is doing and other panels and other people throughout the world, to identify these things. This didn't exist in 1915. And I have to say, if we don't move quickly and in a determined fashion, we're going to see the repeat of what we saw in 1915. It has been less than 200 days since the 4,500-year-old civilization has been displaced. Less than 200 days. I think that if we were to think about 1915, and if we were to be able to take certain actions at that time, we're not dealing with a diaspora of largely orphan children. We're dealing with a diaspora now that is sophisticated and actually has kind of leading expertise in these areas. So we have to undertake actions in defense of the Artsakh Armenians, because the Artsakh Armenians, again, are really the front line in this. We have to argue for their rights. We have to argue for their right to resume their centuries long presence on their territory. And if we don't, we're going to be arguing for the right of Sunni Armenians and the right of Tavush Armenians. So yes, there are a number of forces, and there are larger geopolitical forces outside of Armenia that are at play here. It's no secret, as Professor Theriault mentioned, Israel did more than export weapons to Azerbaijan. It also exported methods of how to subjugate populations. I mean, this is no secret. Even the machines being used, quite frankly, were the same types of machines that are being used, like the actual machines that are being used to monitor the Hakkari Bridge were the same machines being used in the West Bank. So this is not a shocking revelation. We need to combat these things. And yes, the government of Armenia has to play a role in that. And perhaps it's not doing what it needs to do. But that's not an excuse for the global Armenian community not to step up and call this out.
Great. Thank you so much for that answer. I think it was a very powerful response. I can definitely say my colleagues really loved your response. Do any of our other panelists want to address that question? If not, we can definitely move on. Of course, please go right ahead.
Thank you. Actually, Garnik covered the answer, but very shortly. Yes, it's very important. It's a must for us that the Armenian government changes the position over the Artsakh genocide and the collective rights of the Artsakh people in order to push this topic to the Armenian government, Armenian statehood agenda with the international community and Azerbaijan. But it doesn't mean that even if now the Armenian government doesn't have that position, we don't have anything to do. We have a lot to do, both in Armenia, but also in abroad. I mean, in the US, in Europe, wherever it's possible, we should raise our voice. We should educate the politicians. We should build bridges, cooperate with different kind of organizations, public figures, etc., and push the Armenian government in parallel with that in order to have that position one day. Because I believe that without having the Armenian government's position, we will not get the result in the end. I mean, our ultimate goal should be this one. Through the Armenian government's position, we should change also the positions of other governments. Thank you.
Could I add just one quick point as well? And as cynical as my remarks might have sounded, I don't want to convey any kind of sense in which Armenians and others concerned about human rights in this case and other cases should give up. We don't know how geopolitics, how economics and so forth will shift. Azerbaijan could very well, in the arrogance that it has now, overplay its hand in certain ways that will compromise the kind of support that it's getting. We don't know that. If Armenians and others concerned about this issue stop pushing on legal cases, political advocacy, ethical challenges, scholarship, and so forth, then if those changes happen, no one will be in position to actually take up this issue in a meaningful way and get positive results. And so we need to keep pushing. And at the very, very least, to never allow Azerbaijan and all the states, Turkey, and then all the US, Great Britain, and others who are complicit with this, to at least feel morally comfortable with what's happened. We need to keep telling them how wrong it is because at least that can be denied. And then in the future, that might actually have results down the road.
Thank you.
Mm. Well, I feel the country that's most complicit, apart from Azerbaijan, is Armenia itself. And until that changes, nobody else is going to change. I mean, why was anybody expecting anybody to ever recognize Artsakh when Armenia didn't recognize it? And who's going to defend it? Who was going to defend it if Armenia didn't defend it?
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and rather striking given how some other countries treat the advocacy for human rights of people that they have responsibility for, is all I can say. But you're absolutely right.
Well, so isn't Armenia, the government, rumors saying that the Armenian government will withdraw any cases it has at the United Nations and at the World Court against Azerbaijan if there's going to be any peace treaty with Azerbaijan?
There are rumors, and that's part of why I said what I said, that would be a disaster. You don't negotiate. I think Carnegie has said this. You don't negotiate by giving up things up front. Like, that just doesn't make sense. If you think you're negotiating, and especially on a human rights issue where those cases are of incredible ethical principle and are necessary, this is not just about Armenians, but they're necessary for the rule of law globally to protect vulnerable minorities. And Azerbaijan getting away with this someone mentioned the canary in the coal mine, I think Elisa. Azerbaijan getting away with what it's done should be a chilling signal around the world to every vulnerable minority group that if they were able to do this, guess what, you're next. And I really have fear that we're going to see a cascade of similar kinds of invasions and settling of human rights scores in this horrible way.
Thank you. We're going to move on to another question for time. So one question we have is, how can nonprofit organizations such as the Lemkin Institute continue helping grassroots organizations who are actively combating genocide and survivors? How can we better support survivors? What do you all need from us in your fight? Is there anyone who wants to start that answer?
I can say a couple of words on this. I think from a legal perspective, I think that the work of NGOs like the Lemkin Institute is absolutely fundamental to establishing the historical record as it's happening. I always emphasize the fact, and kind of draws on the point that Professor Theriault made as well regarding the cases. The facts laid out are just facts until they're used in legal proceedings, right? Then they become evidence. Evidence is a legal term. It means that you're using certain facts to argue a certain point. So I underline what Professor Theriault said about the travesty of having any of these international cases pulled back, because it would undermine significantly the precedent that's necessary to establish the rights that we're speaking about. That's number one. But the work of NGOs is absolutely critical in forming that evidentiary basis. And we've seen it in the ICJ case. We've seen it in the interstate cases between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the European Court of Human Rights. That evidentiary basis, that evidentiary work, and really also is critical, but also setting narratives. It's really important to be able to frame issues in a way that brings the justice element to the forefront. If we don't frame, for example, I'm going to use this example because I think it's really important. If we were more proactive in calling out the pressure put on Yerevan with respect to the dichotomy between peoples with rights to self-determination and minority rights, this narrative would have gone a little bit differently. Negotiations on what would have happened inside Artsakh would have gone differently. We cannot allow government forces to be able to shift narrative without being checked. You cannot call the Artsakh people a minority, like let's say like a Korean minority in Los Angeles, and expect them to have the right to self-determination. These are things that scholars and NGOs need to be at the forefront of, and frankly, we have been much more than ever before. And I commend the NGOs for the work that they're doing. It's absolutely critical, and we need to be more adamant about that and stay in tune with what the people on the ground actually need. In the case of the Artsakh Armenians, to stay in contact with the Artsakh Armenians, to be able to push the principles, the ideas, and the narratives that they feel, that the people themselves feel are essential to their survival, because nobody knows what this moment feels like more than the Artsakh Armenians. So that type of coordination is absolutely essential. The work of NGOs is crucial, and to be able to check some of these larger geopolitical forces and even political forces within Armenia, in Azerbaijan, in Turkey. These NGOs play a critical role in that. And I think that we need to support the NGOs in those efforts, and allow them that coordination with the Artsakh people.
Thank you. And I believe Mr. Belglarian would like to also answer that. So please go right ahead.
Thank you, Garnik Jan. Actually, very shortly, the first one is for sure pushing narratives. The second one is building capacities of the Artsakh genocide survivors, Artsakh organizations, to raise our voice, because it's very important that on our genocide, on our rights protection, firstly, we should talk about that. I mean, we should be pioneers of protection, of the struggle of protection for our right, the protection of our rights. The third one is building bridges or engaging us in different kind of international networks. And the fourth one, to help us and also to do for sure separately, to apply to different kind of decision makers. I mean, government level, international organizations, intergovernmental organizations, or strong human rights organizations, whatever they are, in order to use all kind of mechanisms for our protection, for genocide recognition, for international justice, etc. Just a very short example. I recently established an NGO. It's called Union for Protection of the Interests and Rights of the Artsakh people. And next week, we are going to launch the organization publicly. And openly, I am telling everyone, to you too, I mean, to the Lemkin Institute, to other organizations, other interested colleagues, that I'm very open to cooperate with anyone, to organize events, to build capacities, to write reports, to write complaints to international organizations or judicial bodies. Whatever it's possible, whatever you can help, whatever you can do together with us, we are open for that kind of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. And the Lemkin Institute, I think I speak for all of us when I say we would love to work in cooperation with you and your new organization. Unfortunately, we are approaching the time limit. I know we could just go on and on all afternoon talking about this. So I am going to go ahead and wrap it up. I apologize to the questions we did not get to answer. Hopefully we can address them in the future. But we would love to thank our esteemed panelists for being here with us today, making time to be here with us and sharing your insight on Armenophobia and the persecution of Armenians in Armenia and worldwide. So thank you all, and thank you to our attendees who have stayed this entire time. we know time just kind of escapes us when we're doing these webinars and seminars. So thank you.
Could I ask quickly? I know there have been a number
course.
of people in the audience who have asked this, and I know some folks who couldn't be here today, at this time to watch this. Will the Lemkin Institute have a recording on your website?
Yes, we will. It will be posted definitely to our YouTube channel and hopefully to our website as well. And I know there are also some questions about the presentations that were used today, whether or not there would be future access to those. So
I think in the form of the recording,
yes,
there'll be access to those. But if anybody would like to be in touch with any of our panelists, please contact us and we will forward your email onto our panelists for them to answer. And hopefully we can have you all back at some point to update on maybe a 6-month update on how things are going, so that this can become a common project between all of us. I want to thank you all so much, as Lexi said, for being here with us and devoting so much of your time and giving us an extra hour of your insights. It's really fantastic. You guys are a great team. And we hope everyone enjoyed our webinar. Thank you all. Bye-bye. Be safe.